So we now know that doses of the Pfizer vaccine are arriving in Canada as we speak. So the question is, let's talk about work. Can your boss force you to take the vaccine? So legal experts were talking to the Toronto Star and they said, this territory is kind of murky because this is a whole balancing act between workplace safety and human rights. Okay, let's all weigh in here. What would you say is the right way to go?
Oh, I think this is so complicated and layered. Let's just first start with the fact that Ipsos did a poll back in November, and they found that only 54% of Canadians would rush out to be vaccinated. So only 54%. That same poll also found that 72% of Canadians supported the idea of mandatory vaccinations, but apparently that amount has since dropped a little bit. I mean, listen, in some sectors this already exists. Some parts of the healthcare field, vaccination can be a condition of your employment. I think the Ontario Ambulance Act, for example, requires that you hold sort of up-to-date vaccines, and that makes some sense. You're in the front line, your healthcare. I think you need to be on board. But all I know is that governments are going to have to get on board with really a huge education plan, because I think right now we are at a real vaccine hesitancy problem. And they have to get to the bottom of how that started, how it's propelled, and who exactly is sending around that information that continues to make people very nervous around the ideas of vaccines.
Well, they better do it fast because, I mean, we've had once a week, I think we've been discussing the complicated ethical issues involved with vaccinations and the personal versus collective rights. That is like the big philosophical debate, right? And so in this situation, let's say, yeah, it is weird for your employers to impose anything on your body that is a human right. But then you get into the very tricky, very practical questions. Your employer, for example, is required to make sure that the electrical in your workplace is safe so that there isn't a fire that breaks out. And if there is a fire that breaks out and hurts people, then typically you could sue your employer for the outbreak of the fire hurting you. So in this vaccine situation, if your employer does not impose vaccines and there's an outbreak of COVID-19 at work, is there grounds for a lawsuit from employees saying, my employer did not keep me safe? On the other side, if you're an employee and there is a policy at work where you have to get vaccinated and you have a negative reaction to the vaccine, I don't know why, for whatever reason, can you sue your
You have an
employer?
allergy.
Do you know what I mean? Like I don't have the answers, but I think to Cynthia's point, people need to be educated, but also like I'm worried that the law and the ethics aren't going to catch up with the rollout of this. And we are going to be running into situations where exactly the situation I named is taking place. And then the courts will have to be dealing with it.
Well, you bring up the courts, Lainey, and that really has to do with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And both those rights and freedoms are not absolutes. You know, we've got laws written in to protect the greater good. For example, like the freedom of expression, there are laws put into place to protect, no hate speech. And so there is a way to do it. And employers are really going to have to figure this out and figure it out quick. Like you say, I mean, I personally have been going into work every day during this pandemic. I've been feeling safe to do so. But that really is because I host a radio show and we're in a studio and we're one after the other in a studio. But the six of us that have gone in there have really created our own safety pack. And I got to be honest, if one of those six decided for whatever reason, allergy or whatever reason to not get the vaccine, I would have a problem with that. I would have a problem going in to work in that same space. And I think then it becomes the responsibility of the employer to act reasonably. And if there's a way for that employee to do their show from home, perhaps that's the way to do it. But, they say we're all in this together and we're going to have to get out of it together as well.
Yeah, it's a great point, Meredith. I think that this is where you're going to have to see government. You're going to have to see government step up into this with public health leading the way as opposed to employers, because this ultimately is a public health issue. And the example that I use for all of this is what happens in schools. Across Canada, it is not mandatory to get vaccinations for your children. There are a few exceptions. We do have Ontario and New Brunswick, and for measles, Manitoba. But no, that is to allow your child to go to school. They require vaccinations, and then they can opt out for either religious or conscience reasons or health issues. So here's the thing. I think this is going to come down to how do you balance human rights and workplace safety? Here's the deal. You can choose. It's your body. No one can force you to take a vaccine, not even your employer. However, it doesn't mean that if you choose to opt out of vaccines that you will be allowed to have the same freedoms and choices as everybody else who does have a vaccination. Now, this is getting into controversial territory, and I know it. There's the discussion of things called immunization passports. Maybe you're not going to be allowed to fly without one. Maybe you won't be able to work in the office. Maybe you will only be allowed to work from home. So there's going to be those gray areas where this is going to be tested, but maybe we take the pressure off of employers and let the blowback come to public health and government, because they could mandate it. They could say it's mandated across the board. So far, nobody wants to get into a fight with the public about mandating vaccines. But I think that if you're going to solely put it on employers, you're going to get into those cases that you were talking about, Lainey, which is all of this being decided in courts. But I think when it comes to the greater good, there are examples already in place that you can choose to not get it, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to allow to move about this world as freely as you did before.
Moving on. It's going to be, I think, a conversation we're going to have for many weeks to come.